So today we're sponsoring, JCPA, a session with Professor Gerald Steinberg and Dov Yarden on the counter strategies that they employ combating BDS in the United Nations and the European Union and on the campus. I'll introduce both gentlemen at this point. They will present. We will then have a Q&A session. Yael has a microphone that will be able to be shared for those who wish to ask a question. Professor Gerald Steinberg, as I mentioned earlier, is a JCPA fellow. He's founder and president of NGO Monitor, and he's professor of political studies at Bar-Ilan University. He initiated there at Bar-Ilan a program on conflict management and negotiation. He directed that program for a good while. His research interests include international relations, Middle East diplomacy and security, the politics of human rights and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, Israeli politics and arms control. His op-ed columns appear in periodicals. You've all seen them in the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, International Herald Tribune. He's appeared as a commentator on BBC, CBC, CNN, and NPR. And for those of you who have seen him, you know that he does a darn good job in that presentation. Dov Yarden, who also is a friend and has someone I work with closely through NGO Monitor, was appointed NGO's Monitor in March of 2008. He oversees the management and the day-to-day operations, including responsibility for financial planning, personnel, and donor relations. Don't kid yourself, though he sounds like an administrator. He knows this material quite well as well. Prior to joining NGO Monitor, he was a high-tech entrepreneur, one of the founders of the Unicorn Solutions. He managed their global information technologies and administration until the company was bought by IBM in 2006. Gerald, and then Dov.
Thanks, Howard. Thanks to Chaya. Thanks to the JCPA framework for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for making this a sellout. That looks good on my CV. Actually, I think maybe I'll put this up too, and then that way I'll remember to talk about it. Actually, I'll pass this around so people can flip through it, and I'll talk about that later. There have been a series of articles the last few weeks, and there'll be more, talking about 10 years since the founding of the BDS movement and featuring Omar Barghouti. Well, those are wrong. Anybody here from any journalists here? I have to be careful not to insult too many people at the beginning. The BDS movement, as part of the broader demonization of Israel, or what I prefer to use the term, the political war against Israel, there are lots of landmarks along the way. We could talk about this from 48. We could talk about it from 1975 and the Zionism is racism resolution. But I think the time that makes the most sense to talk about this is the Durban Conference, and I'm not going to talk long about the Durban Conference of 2001 because you've all heard me speak about this ad infinitum. But it was, in fact, at the Durban Conference that the concept of boycotting Israel, applying the same techniques that were used against South Africa, the apartheid regime, and taking that as a package and applying it directly to Israel, that's when that process began. And the language that they used in their final declaration, there were 1,500 NGOs that were there. That's why NGO Monitor became a viable organization, because I realized that these are part of the very central to this form of political warfare. So you had 1,500 organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, a number of Palestinian groups, many others, European groups. And the declaration they adopted, the one specific issue they all agreed upon was that Israel was a racist apartheid regime. This was all manipulated and prepared in advance in what they call a preparatory conference that took place in Tehran. And the bottom line, call on the international community to impose a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. That is the beginning of the BDS movement. This took place in September 2001. 2002, we had Operation Defensive Shield. We had all the terrorist attacks that were taking place in Jerusalem, in Netanya, and elsewhere. And then we had what was called by the Palestinians and then the BBC and Amnesty International the Jenin Massacre. And immediately after that, in the middle of 2002, we begin to see the academic boycott grow in the UK. So this all predates Omar Barghouti. Barghouti was clever. He's riding that wave. But if Barghouti was not around, 90% of, at least, of what we see as the boycott and demonization of Israel would be taking place anyway. Why is that the case? There are a number of central, the term that the Ruud Institute used was hubs, processes, frameworks that accelerate this process. And the United Nations Human Rights Council is central. I would say if I had to take two places, maybe three, where this is really focused, it's first of all Brussels, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, where a lot of the funding is coming from in different ways. In other words, the European Union and its member states. A second location, in all these places we see a very high visibility and activity of the same NGO community. Geneva, and that's what I'm going to start talking about, the United Nations Human Rights Council as a hub or a focus that propels the demonization of Israel and BDS. And perhaps the third would be London, because that's where a lot of the NGOs are actually located, Amnesty in particular, but many others as well, and that also has turned out to be a hub. So the United Nations Human Rights Council, first of all, when I talked about the Durban conference, that was a product. In those days it was called a commission. I won't go through the history and the differences. For all intents and purposes, there aren't any differences. They're both Israel-bashing organizations. They are both controlled. The commission was controlled. The council is now controlled by the five regions, three of those regions that create the agenda and the appointments and the processes in Geneva are controlled by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So it's essentially an automatic majority for anything there that's anti-Israel. There are 47 members on the council, and even if the Europeans would all vote with us, something which I'll talk about in a minute, there would still be a majority clearly for anti-Israel resolutions and investigations and the whole package that we see. As part of that process, in Geneva, at every meeting, the council meets formally 3 times a year. Then it has emergency sessions, of which half, I think, are always about Israel. When it meets, there is an agenda, and there's something called Permanent Agenda Item 7. It's the only agenda item that addresses a particular country, and it's entitled Human Rights Situation in Palestine and Other Occupied Arab Territories. I don't have to interpret that language for you, but that is something which automatically comes up at every one of the 3 meetings that take place every year in Geneva. It's a forum for intense Israel bashing. In addition, there are resolutions and reports, and if you look at the numbers, and this comes from UN Watch, which keeps a very careful tally, and they're based in Geneva, so of the 103 total resolutions that were adopted since the commission became the council in 2006, over half have targeted Israel. 7 special sessions, which is, I think, 6 more than, maybe 5 more than any other country or region in the world. The rest are 1 and 2 and 0. And the commissions of inquiry, the COI, when we talk about those may be the most lethal weapons that the UN Human Rights Council has. They were the ones who issued reports going back to Jenin, that condemned Israel, and each one of the reports follows a similar pattern. There, I think, have been 7 or I think 8 with the latest one that have been issued. They follow a similar pattern. They adopt a resolution. They appoint a commission of inquiry with a mandate, which is very similar or worse than the language of Agenda Item 7 of the Israeli responsibility for the war crimes that were committed or things, an investigation. It's always focused or using that kind of language. And so that it already finds Israel guilty, and your job as a commissioner, in a commission of investigation, is to document the evidence so that, because we already know Israel's guilty. And that's how all of these commissions of inquiry take place. And that was the Goldstone report. Some of you may remember Beit Hanun. That was one in which there was an incident in which Israel, the IDF, was responding to rocket and terror attacks, and there were a number of civilians that were reportedly killed in Israeli counterattack. And at that point, the UN immediately had the usual suspects rounded up, And they wanted to appoint Erwin Kotler along with Desmond Tutu, and Professor Kotler, I don't think it took too much persuasion, said, no, thank you, I don't want to take part in this kangaroo court, but Desmond Tutu did. And then the next round of that was with the Goldstone report, where they found someone who was willing to take his Jewish identity and his connections with Israel and put it on the cover of a report. That was the Goldstone report, and now we just had what we call the Shabbos-Davis report. One of the interesting aspects of all of that process, one of the central aspects in Geneva, is the presence at every aspect of and every dimension of the NGOs. It wasn't just at Durban that they had an NGO forum, and in some cases there's a forum, in many cases they no longer have what they call a forum, but NGOs are very present and visible, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The Human Rights Council would be very different without the very strong involvement of NGOs. And we can illustrate this, and I want to spend some time talking about what happened, what was it, about 2 weeks ago, roughly, in Geneva. First of all, we were there, NGO Monitor was there, and I'll tell you about the things that we did. There were a number of other organizations that were there participating as United Nations recognized, or what are called ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council recognized NGOs that have, as a result of that recognition, have the right to give 2-minute speeches within the sessions and also to hold side events. And that's very important, and I'll talk about that. As well, it's easier to meet the delegates in the lounges that are around where the sessions take place, in the hallways and the corridors. You really see what's going on, and that's what I want to report to you, because, again, there was nothing that I would say was unique or unusual, but in and of itself, the daily operations of the Human Rights Council illustrate the way in which this war against Israel takes place. And it's very important, as I develop the details, for me to point out that this fuels the BDS process. I'll talk later on about the money aspect, but this is the content that's provided. This is the ideological, political, and even the imagery that's provided in terms of the demonizing Israel, the process of accusing Israel of committing war crimes, of violating international law, violating human rights. All of those ingredients are there in this process. At many of the BDS resolutions that are adopted on U.S. campuses, certainly in Europe it's a different process. It's not resolutions. You don't need a resolution because Israel's already guilty on many European campuses. But the rhetoric that is used in the media as well, in the church groups against Israel, they will almost inevitably quote from one of these reports, because it's the United Nations. There's no question that what these reports are presenting must be complete truth, must be unbiased, and if these reports, the Goldstone report with 500 pages of an indictment against Israel, with what Goldstone said were 36 examples, incidents of Israeli war crimes. The latest report was presented 2 weeks ago yesterday by Mary McGowan Davis. As I said, we call it the Shabbos-Davis report. And it had about a total of it was 150 pages of documentations and about a 40 or 50 page executive summary. That's a lot less than Goldstone. I guess we can all say that's some progress in there. And it doesn't have a list of 36 incidents. It's got less. But someone who's reading the two reports would say, okay, this is the latest, the 2015 report is a sort of lightly watered down version of the Goldstone report. And that's going to be taken across the campuses and across the churches and cited as examples of Israeli war crimes. So that's why this is so important. It's not shmum, as the Israeli Foreign Ministry used to say, and I think maybe less so now, although I'm never completely convinced. It's not so the UN says things and condemns us, who cares? This fuels, as I said, in the substantive, in the legal, and in the ideological sense, the moral sense, the BDS movement in many of its forms. So it's important to see what goes into these reports. But just a brief reminder that this report, this was presented by an American judge, Mary McGowan Davis. Initially, when this commission, the COI, was established by the United Nations Human Rights Council after the 2014 Gaza war, they appointed a gentleman by the name of William Shabbos, a professor of law who had basically he's a Canadian but has spent a lot of his time recently in Ireland. He was the one who said that his goal is to bring, this was about 2 or 3 years before the, back in I think 2010 or so, he said his goal was to bring Bibi Netanyahu before the International Criminal Court for his war crimes in the Gaza war of 2008-2009. Well, first of all, Netanyahu was not the prime minister. It tells you what this professor of international law, well-known professor of international law, wasn't so accurate on his facts, but also he was very close to many of these NGOs. He was in many ways the patron and the ally of one of the key actors in this, Shawan Jabarin. Shawan Jabarin heads Al-Haq. Al-Haq is the most important single NGO in promoting cases against Israelis in courts and in the International Criminal Court in particular. There are cases, many cases in Israel, but also cases in Canada brought by Al-Haq, which thankfully they lost, but against Israel and against firms for dealing with all forms of BDS. And that's where the 2 points merge between lawfare and BDS. So Shabbos was very much part, in Hebrew you would say he was part of the branja. He was part of the framework of both academics and people involved with the UN, and at the same time very closely related to NGOs that had been promoting the demonization of Israel for many years. And he was appointed, not a surprise to anybody looking at the way the commission operates, as the council operates, he was appointed as the person to lead this commission of inquiry. Now, he was later on caught not having filled out his forms accurately, because when you apply for a UN position, you have to present a form which includes potential conflicts of interest. And he left out one minor issue, the fact that he was a paid consultant for the PLO. And it's interesting that when that was, when a formal complaint was filed, I believe by the government of Canada, and the president of the Human Rights Council, a German diplomat, received that, he then responded that the UN would undertake an investigation. Almost immediately afterwards, Shabbos then resigned, but he said that the report had been largely completed. This was at the end of February. The report was supposed to be presented to the United Nations Human Rights Council at the end of March. So he said, okay, we did 90% of our work, there's 3 more works to go. They can put the cover on it, they can put the seal on it, no big deal. But Mary McGowan Davis, who did accept the position of being his number 2 and therefore was implicated from the beginning, she assumed the leadership of the commission, and she decided that it needed to have more time, and so maybe strictly for public presentation purposes, it didn't look so good to come up with a report immediately after the person who was closely associated was forced to resign. And so the report then was delayed, and it was eventually presented on June 29th. So it had this whole long ups and down process. And we know that, for instance, Shabbos did not have anybody with a military background, at least not officially advising the committee. And Mary McGowan Davis then added an anonymous military expert, which in itself is a problem. And we assumed that there were other significant changes that were made. There was another round of bringing Israelis to Geneva to testify before the 2-member commission. Now the 3rd member was a diplomat from, I believe, Senegal, and Dudien, and also played a role in this process, but this was clearly led by McGowan Davis. When the report was presented, the process works that there's quite a bit of drama that's built up. It was interesting. Usually, the reports that are issued by the UN Human Rights Council are presented to the governments at least 2 to 3 weeks before they are presented in the council in order to get comments and any kind of official corrections that might want to be made before. This report, as far as I can tell, was only made available less than a week before the actual council session. Something like that. Do you remember exactly when it came out? I think it might have come out on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and it was presented the following Monday, which is unusual in itself. It suggests a rush job, number one, even with all the extra time. number. So there wasn't a lot of time, and it seemed that it was made public within a few hours, maybe a day of the time that it was presented to the governments. The journalists got hold for embargo notices, and very quickly, and then there were different times that were announced. So this report was not, unlike the Goldstone report, which was pretty much available a few weeks before it was formally presented to the council. This report came quite quickly, and therefore it didn't leave a lot of time for analysis or for response. And so the council session that took place on Monday in Geneva was in itself significant. What were the dramas involved? We knew what the contents were then going to be. The question is, what would be the positions taken by the governments? What would be the statements that were made? Where would this report go? Along with or close to the time that the report was introduced, there was also a resolution. That's how the process works. They issue a report, then the council is asked to vote on a resolution which adopts the report as an official text, and then includes some language about adopting its recommendations, some yes, some no. And in this case, the resolution was essentially, the initial resolution was, let's take this report, wrap it up in a nice folder, send it to the International Criminal Court, and demand that the ICC use this material in order to accelerate its investigation against Israel. And there were a number of other clauses in the resolution, including the suggestion that the findings in the report should be used as a form of increasing the sanctions against Israel, or developing sanctions, including perhaps sanctions on the ability to obtain weapons. Now, again, one could say, well, that's just the UN resolution, but if the UN adopts a resolution like that, and that's been the goal of the BDS movement for a long time. They tried to do it with the apartheid wall, quote, case for the International Court of Justice in 2004. The purpose of that was to create a framework so that the UN would adopt a resolution that would then say, because Israel is violating these aspects of international law, governments that are members of the UN should not be selling Israel weapons or technology or other things. That was also part of this process. It's perennial. So the drama was in looking and seeing particularly what the Europeans were going to say. That the Europeans are key in all of this, because although there are 5 actual members of the council, so it's not going to be, the Europeans are not going to change the outcome of the vote. The Americans vote still, despite everything that's been going on. They spoke out publicly, and they voted with Israel. That was essentially a given at the beginning of this meeting. But the question was because if the majority of Europeans, along with other like-minded democratic states that happen to be members of the council at the time, if the European Union makes a statement and takes a position against the resolution and against adopting the report, that's significant. It's called a quality majority, if not a majority of the members of the council, without Russia and Cuba and the members of the Islamic bloc, Algeria and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and others, they're not going to vote for us. But if we get a significant group of democratic states, and the fact that India is a member, and in this case abstained, was important, was significant, then that would send a message. It would decrease the moral implications, the moral value of this report. It would make it harder for the International Criminal Court to take it at face value, for instance. That was the goal here. And so with the presentation of the report, then each country makes a statement. The Europeans, not surprisingly, their initial statement was very neutral. It was parv. It pointed out problems with the bias of the initial mandate. At the same time, it talked about the need for compliance with international law and the importance of the investigation. The Europeans have a strong investment in the mechanisms of the UN, different than the United States, even under Obama, certainly very different than Israel. For Europe, the UN continues to have that symbolic, what they call normative power implications. And so if it becomes adopted, then you will see many European countries, and the EU as a formal policy, 28 countries adopting sanctions and limitations on Israel in some degree. So it was important to get that out there. The statements are made the way it works, and it's a bubble. The whole framework of the UN Human Rights Council really is a bubble. And people spend their days, their weeks, their months inside there. And it really is amazing to see how much it is isolated, somebody should do a sociology study of it, and a political study, because it's so tightly wound. The things that are in there just revolve around and around and around and become intensified, and they lose track of reality completely in there, and anybody who walks in there. When you hear a Syrian delegate or an Iranian delegate talking about Israeli war crimes, when the representative from the Saudi Arabia refers to Israel as an apartheid state, that these are supposed to be our allies in working on Iran. You hear that kind of language in the UN, and you really wonder. It's not that you're surprised that you hear the Syrians and the Iranians condemning Israel for killing innocent Palestinians. That's not surprising. What's surprising is that all these other delegates are sitting there and not saying anything. They're not even laughing. They're not considering this to be insane. And that type of process takes place day after day, over and over again, and to the point where it becomes normal, and has become normal. What I think one of the important things that changes some of this is the role of NGOs. NGOs that are accredited get 2 minutes. The state representatives only get 3, so it's not that different. When the NGOs get there, it's not quite as predictable. The language is a little bit sharper, not in terms of some of the stuff we heard from the Saudis and the Syrians, the Iranians, but talking about the content of the report itself, for instance. And usually it's not quite in Hebrew. You say batel b'shishim, 1 out of 60. It's not. But roughly the ratio of NGOs that are present and that are part of the alliance between the Islamic bloc and the UN leadership, the UN Human Rights Council permanent staff, and the NGOs is a very tight alliance. And you very often see a revolving door. So you have a member of the staff of a high-level member of the UN staff that writes a lot of these reports, is a former, more than a researcher for Amnesty International. Turns out that her husband, who's a European diplomat, is also formerly a researcher at Amnesty International. So you have all of these, again, the internally tightening loops that take place among the personnel and in terms of the language that's used. When NGOs come in, they do something different, at least when we come in the room. NGOs that are not part of that process. And first of all, the first thing is, and we saw that in 2009, that was the last time when I think we had a significant impact on this. When you bring in a lot of speakers and presence, you don't just bring in yourselves, you can bring in a couple of guests, and if all the organizations there, B'nai B'rith International was there, and World Jewish Congress was there, World Union of Jewish Students, UN Watch was a permanent presence, NGO Monitor, and so you have 10, 15, 20 people in the room, and a number of them are speaking. That makes a difference. And you're lobbying and you're giving your reports to the delegates, and that makes a difference. I want to show you I guess I have to do this over here. This is a very quick video. This is Richard Kemp. Hopefully we can make the whole thing if you can make it big side.
Mr. Vice President, I fought in combat zones around the world during 30 years' service in the British Army. I was present as an observer throughout the Gaza conflict. Mr. Vice President, during the 2014 Gaza conflict, Hamas, to its eternal shame, did more to deliberately and systematically inflict death, suffering and destruction on its own civilian population, including its children, than any other terrorist group in history. Hamas deliberately positioned its fighters and weapons in civilian areas, knowing that Israel would have no choice but to attack these targets, which were a clear and present threat to the lives of Israel's own civilian population. While the IDF made efforts, unprecedented in any other army, and exceeding the requirements of the laws of war, to save Palestinian civilian lives, including warning them to leave target zones, Hamas forced them to remain in those areas. Unable to defeat Israel by military means, Hamas sought to cause large numbers of casualties among their own people in order to bring international condemnation against Israel, especially from the United Nations. This was the cornerstone of Hamas's strategy. It was Hamas's strategy, not illegal Israeli action, as this report shamefully alleges, without a shred of evidence, that was the reason why over 1,000 civilians died in Gaza. By denying this truth and by refusing to admit the manifest reality that the conflict in Gaza was caused by Hamas's war of aggression against Israel, this report faithfully reiterates Hamas's own false narrative. This council has for too long allowed itself to become a tool of Hamas's murderous strategy by unjustly condemning Israel, by refusing to condemn Hamas's repeated and unprovoked aggression. This council has consistently validated and encouraged Hamas's terror tactics.
You get exactly 2 minutes. At the end of 2 minutes, they cut you off. But those words are almost never heard in the Human Rights Council. And it does cause consternation is an understatement. It causes anger among those NGOs that are used to having these platforms entirely for themselves. You want to go to the next one? We'll do part of that's me. I got to do me into it too. At each section of the agenda, there is the state parties, and then there are the NGOs that speak. Go ahead, you hit it. I won't let it go for the full 2 minutes, but.
Yep, that's right. President, the discussion that we've heard in the last few hours on terrorism and its victims
This was the next
stands
day.
in very sharp contrast to the discussion we heard in this very chamber yesterday, what was called a commission inquiry on the Gaza conflict, but which almost entirely ignored the terrorism that was waged, the terrorist war that was waged by Hamas and its allies just a year ago. The failure to address the real terrorism is a real problem for this important organization. To address the substance, we don't have a commission of inquiry on this kind of terrorism, and I think we need to have one.
This is what I was talking about.
Terms like the right of resistance is a justification for terrorism. It's very important for the members of this body to make it clear there is no right of resistance, there is no right of terrorism against innocent people. There is no right to send 4,563 rockets against Israeli cities.
Okay, you can kill it there. And anybody who wants to watch the whole thing, you can see it on various websites.
Cities killing people in Europe, the United States, and any place else.
So being in the room,
the genocidal language that
being in the room gives you the chance to make these statements, and then afterwards to talk to the delegates that are there. So within an hour after these statements were made, we had talked to the Canadians, we had talked to the United States as someone that we don't have to work too hard to convince. But the EU, the Spanish, there were a number of delegates in the room, and we were able to sit down and go through the details with them. It's not that they don't know that these kinds of claims exist, but they've never been brought face to, or rarely been brought face to face with these issues. And it's also not being done. The Israeli government has a problem in these sessions. Officially, Israel has a policy of not participating in Israel bashing. And in fact has convinced the European, supposedly the European Union, not to attend and participate in any of the discussions under permanent agenda item 7. So the presence of NGOs also adds to the importance of being able to get that message across. Not being part of the Israeli government, but being civil society and being able to use language that diplomats may not want to use is something I think that adds significantly to the process. So being in the room is important. This was a parallel, or another event that we did. We did with UN Watch. We brought in Richard Kemp for more than 2 minutes, 20 minutes. Izzy Rubens spoke, the guy who, the Israeli developer of the anti-missile systems, first the Arrow and very involved in the Iron Dome. And he gave a 20-minute presentation. He wrote the chapter in our book with the counter report that we presented. This event was to present the counter report that we had written, and there was a second counter report that was also presented. You can see that we're holding up the book there. And we brought in Richard Kemp, the head of British forces in Afghanistan at the time, and 2 American generals that were very versed in the issues of international law and fighting in these kinds of areas, talking about Fallujah and the complexities the Americans had faced, and making this not a discussion about Israel, but a discussion about the deep problems of dealing with terrorist warfare and the inadequacy of the international legal framework and the failure primarily of the Shabas-Davis report to deal with those issues. We had about between 100 and 150 people in the room. The room was packed. It was bigger than this. It was a large room, one of the largest rooms in the UN complex, so that was important. And they stayed for most of the 2 hours, most of them, and there were a number of diplomats. Again, in having conversations with them, they don't say things like, we've never heard this before, but by the questions that they ask and by the conversations that are held, those that are seriously interested in going beyond the slogans, this is an opportunity for them to hear these different perspectives. So when you have both a senior member of the American military and a professor of international law, Jeff Korn, talking about the misapplication of international law in these reports, and particularly in the report that was just issued the day before, that has a significant impact. It's listened to. And that's the whole purpose of going to Geneva and having these kinds of events. So we also brought in Jonathan Schanzer, who talked about Hamas finances. When we talk about, in Geneva, when they talk about Israel and Gaza, the word Hamas is almost never mentioned. And if you look at the report that was issued, first in Goldstone, I think Hamas was not mentioned at all. This time it was mentioned, but almost entirely in quoting Israelis, not independently. It's usually the Palestinian armed factions is the term that's often used, the euphemism. So the word terror and Hamas is something we had to bring together. Financing a terror organization is a clear violation of international law, but you will never find it in any of these UN reports. So we brought in Jonathan Schanzer from the Foundations for the Defense of Democracy in Washington, who wrote a chapter in the book and presented it in this site event that took place. This is the book. This is the table of contents. We distributed dozens, I think 150 copies we sent to Geneva, and every delegation got one. Every journalist got one. The contents, and I won't go into this in great detail, the contents of the report, just like Goldstone, we knew what was going to happen in advance, no surprises, largely based on NGO allegations. The most visible NGO in this report is B'Tselem. 69 citations of B'Tselem, particularly from a report they issued called Black Flag, with so many either mistakes or unknowns that were interpreted, particularly in killing of civilians. There are a number of examples in the B'Tselem report that were cut and paste into the McGowan-Davis report, and last week into an amnesty app on Gaza of high-level Hamas operatives where there are films of them in their regalia listed as civilian casualties. The whole issue, which revolves around the allegation that Israel killed an inordinate number of civilians, deliberately, intentionally killed civilians, that's the core of the allegations against Israel constantly. Well, when the data is taken from from a group of NGOs and the NGOs themselves don't know, then that seriously impacts on the credibility of the report. That's understated. And so we see that simply being cut and paste throughout these reports. I don't have time to talk about Izzy Rubens' presentation, but I think it was the first time in Geneva at the UN that anybody showed images of Hamas rockets being fired at Israel. And he went through the whole process. So you have somebody from Oxfam or Amnesty sitting there who was arguing for opening up, ending the blockade, what they call the collective punishment, and allowing the Gazans to rebuild their houses. And he's talking about how fertilizer and all sorts of chemicals and concrete are being used for the Hamas terror machine. That's important to have it stated in Geneva as well. And just as an additional final comment on Geneva, also outside, to the credit of these, a lot of organizations, they also organized a rally. And traffic, what was interesting was anybody who left the building around noon, you had to take a detour. And when you asked the police, I went back to the hotel, why do I have to take a detour? And they said, well, this area is closed as a demonstration. What's the demonstration? It's a pro-Israel demonstration. There were a number of buses. People drove all night in buses from places like Holland and elsewhere to participate in this demonstration. That hasn't happened since 2009. And first of all, for the participants, that makes a difference. It says we're out there, we're defending Israel against the travesty that goes on inside. And the people on the inside saw and got the reports. Anybody who was outside knew that there was something going on, which is, in this case, unusual. It's not a pro-Palestine demonstration. It's a pro-Israeli demonstration. So this was, I think, a good example of what needs to be done in Geneva. And I'll just end this section, and I'll have a few minutes to talk about the funding. In Geneva, we need to do this not once every 5 years. It needs to be done 2 or 3 times a year whenever there are these sessions in all the different pieces. It needs to be much more intense cooperation between the Israeli government and the NGOs to facilitate this process. We've got to develop more capabilities. More organizations have to sign up and go through the torturous process of ECOSOC recognition and then try to work together in order to create a critical mass, as the NGOs, the anti-Israel NGOs do, and frankly do a good job of it usually. The other half of this that I want to talk about in terms of developments is the funding aspects. That's a lot of NGO Monitor's bread and butter. That's the issue that we focus on. That's what we do uniquely, following the money. Just as a bridge, the dozens of NGOs that have almost permanent, some cases permanent delegations in Geneva, that they are on first name basis. Shawan Jabarin, the head of Al-Haq, who's also a member of the board, I think, of Human Rights Watch. He's everywhere and has been labeled by the Israeli Supreme Court as a Jekyll and Hyde. By day, a human rights activist. By night, he has worked with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That's a terror organization. And he's everywhere in Geneva. Everybody knows him. And there are many other delegates. In Brussels, you see the one of the people from Breaking the Silence, and everybody knows her. In each of these places, they have the ability, they have the resources to have a constant presence. And that's the money aspect. The money feeds this process, both in terms of being physically available to make these kinds of presentations. That's not cheap to do that, to have those personnel, but also in terms of the publications and the videos and the social media. The presence of the NGOs and their impact is huge on all of this process. Again, all of the UN reports on Israel are largely cut and paste jobs from the NGO reports. These take very significant infrastructure. The money comes largely from Europe. When a campus in Berkeley adopts a BDS resolution and it cites UN reports and it cites Breaking the Silence and it cites Amnesty and it cites B'Tselem, that's where all this comes from. And the scale is huge. And I don't think up until a year or two ago, in terms of the people in the Israeli government, the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office, the MFA had really realized how big the scale was. We use the term 100 million euros estimate. Some of the money's secret. I think that we're probably well beyond that as we uncover more organizations that are getting funding. They're getting funding primarily from about 10 European governments. The only European government, the only Western European government that's not funding BDS in some way is Greece, for obvious reasons. And Portugal. Portugal, to the best of our knowledge, is not funding them. Well, that goes a different direction, but yeah. Every other government provides anywhere from 2 to 3 to, in some cases, 10 million euros, krona, pounds a year to organizations that are deeply involved in NGOs. And again, this is not going to be the time to present all of this, but just to give you a couple of images which I think need to be addressed. When I spoke in Brussels last time, I presented this graph. This is the funding analysis of a framework called European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. They have an annual budget of around 120 million euros a year. That's a huge financial operation, which is run by a small group of European bureaucrats that sit in Brussels. The commissioner who's responsible for this budget can't possibly know where the money goes in each case. They give to hundreds of NGOs. They don't collect statistics. They don't do analysis. We did that. So we took the latest data that we had a year ago. They also don't publish annual data. You have to go through each country, which is not trivial. And we said, who gets money from this organization to promote democracy and human rights? Which country in the world has to get the most support from Europe because it cannot do human rights and democracy on its own? No prizes for guessing. Israel is way above everybody else. In the Middle East, in their Middle East North Africa section, which is one of the largest in terms of funding in the world, half of the money goes to NGOs that are B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence and all these other organizations, Coalition of Women for Peace, Who Profits, you name it, they're all out there. And these are organizations that in different ways, some more concretely in promoting BDS, and some of them in a more abstract way, accusing Israel of war crimes, but not saying we support BDS. And this money, there's an army out there of people. These are huge budgets. Let's take the example of Breaking the Silence. I don't know if that's the next one that I have. Okay. Anyway, that shows you the disproportionality. Just one of the major sources within that framework, this is not the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, but each country also has its own framework. there's another framework called the Secretariat for Human Rights and International Law. The $4 to $5 million a year that goes to those organizations are provided by 4 governments: Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, and Holland. It goes to Ramallah, to the Human Rights and International Law program at Birzeit University to be administered. And this is an example. Can you just click on that picture? This is an example of what they produce. This is a 90-second video. I believe it's in Arabic. It's about the right. It's supporting human rights. That's what they're supposed to do, right? This is. This is what Palestinians are being shown about human rights by the 4 European governments that fund videos and. This was a few months ago. It was produced. It's obviously after the war. This is the language which we translated is about your right to have the freedoms, to have international law, that everybody has the right to demand that these international regulations, and this is funded by the Human Rights and IHL Secretariat. And one of our researchers came up with that, and you can see the kind of work that we do to find these things. I won't tell you which ambassador, I sat with an ambassador representing one of these 4 countries the other day. I also took it to one of their capitals, different country, presented this movie. And they said, we don't know anything about this. It's pure propaganda. It's incitement and propaganda. How did this happen? Well, it's your funding. Why don't you know? Well, we go through so many different channels. If you multiply this by dozens, each country, as I said, there are about 10 to 12 countries. Norway, Sweden are the higher, Germany are the higher budget countries that provide this, Switzerland, and then it goes all the way through. And then they also have in parallel church organizations. But just as a side comment, these are the NGOs that are quoted in the McGowan or the Shabbos-Davis report. 69 that are funded by the Secretariat, by this Switzerland, Holland, Denmark, and Sweden consortium, through Ramallah, through Birzeit. That report, 69 times B'Tselem, 50 times the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. Almost all the quotes, all of them are about the killing of civilians, allegedly as part of Israeli deliberate attempts to destroy Palestinian society in Gaza, and therefore war crimes. And 50 times, 69 times, Al-Haq 19 times. These are central. Without this funding, and this is emergency funding, they got to contribute to the report. And that's where I'm closing the circle. It goes from the countries to Birzeit, to Geneva, to the campuses in the United States and Europe. Not quite a straight line, I said a circle, but it's all connected in this way. And it's been well entrenched since at least 2000, 2001. Just a quick comment, because I started to say that each of the Western European countries also has a Christian or a Christian framework for providing humanitarian aid. In most of these countries, they outsource their humanitarian aid to Christian Aid, to ICO, which is a Dutch Protestant, I believe, humanitarian aid organization, Broederlijk Delen. Broederlijk Delen. I'm working on it, which is a Belgian organization. The Belgian embassy no longer provides funding to individual Israeli NGOs. That's a success. By the way, the same is true for the British and a few others. But when you look at what goes on in Brussels, they provide a huge amount of money, of which 1 million euros a year roughly goes to NGOs that we're talking about here. It's run by one person, the decisions, Hermans. Do you remember her first name? There's one individual, Brigitte Hermans. For years, she has been deciding where this is government money goes, and it goes to breaking the silence, and it goes to Zochrot. Zochrot is what we call a 1948 organization. So they can travel to Brussels to say how terrible the Israeli government is in committing war crimes, on the basis of which they get more money to come back the next year. Another Christian organization, and there's one in almost every Western European country, and they're almost all funding the same organizations, give or take. I can never get this right. Trocaire, which is the Irish Catholic aid organization. And they're funding Who Profits, which is the NGO, the Israeli NGO that identifies, next week we're going to do orange. Today it's Elbit. I don't remember what's next on their list. They play a crucial role in BDS. They're funded by the Irish. They're also funded by the Dutch government through these Christian aid organizations, and many, many other examples which I won't go into now. Now, just to end my section, have I used your time already too? Our purpose is not just to say oy vey. Our purpose here is to focus on what can be done. The first stage is to make this information publicly available. I really don't think, and I've had some discussions with some Israeli leaders who disagree with me on this, but I think that in most cases the Europeans at the top of the system who are nominally responsible for this funding and distribution to NGOs have no idea what's actually done with the money. I've sat in meetings and I've seen jaws drop when we show them the movie of the Secretariat, when we show them what Breaking the Silence does. They said, oh, we heard this was a peace organization. I had one high-level European diplomat say to me yesterday, yes, I know about Breaking the Silence. They show us the history of Hebron. Well, that's about one, maybe 20th or even less of the total Breaking the Silence budget, which is primarily used for travel to other countries, not in Hebron. But to say Israel commits war crimes, does other things which are illegal, immoral, 10 days in Zurich, a couple of days in Bern, presenting this to legislators, and it goes on and on. The officials in charge of this funding, in most cases, do not have a significant grasp of where the funding goes. I've seen that in Spain, seen it in Switzerland, seen it in Holland, in almost every country. I can't think of an exception. In Germany, now there may be, and I'm not saying there are no officials. I'm sure that Brigitte Hermans knows exactly where the money goes. But she has a low-level position. The minister responsible for that budget, and even perhaps the heads of the church who run the organization, probably don't know. So part of the process has to be to make the information available to them. And it's very important for us to take this information directly ourselves so that we can show them exactly where the money goes and how it's being abused and exploited. And this is what we did in the case of Breaking the Silence. We presented the information, the map of the 55 places approximately that Breaking the Silence has spoken outside of Israel. It's also Australia and South Africa, which is below that, in the last 2 years, and many other examples of a way the money is not being used in order to promote peace in any reasonable understanding of the term. And we certainly got good feedback. It got into the newspapers, and there are discussions that are going on in Switzerland about the propriety of this, as there are in other countries. We have had some changes in the funding processes through this type of, first of all, research, publication, and then some degree of naming and shaming. The embassies, as I said, of the UK, Belgium, and Spain have all ended their funding for Israeli political NGOs, what we call political NGOs, which are all the groups that we're talking about. And if somebody says, well, do they give money to any other organizations? Almost not. Occasionally there's a program for cooperation, like Save a Child's Heart, and which is both Israelis and Palestinians that work together, but in most cases they are highly politicized anti-Israel organizations, all on one part of the political spectrum. So we have some reason to say, yes, by providing this information, we are able to change some policies. In other cases, the funding is more global, and funding does get cut because of budget cuts back, but they're aware of the fact that their money is being wasted. When you have budgetary crisis, and in Finland, they just cut back a large part of their global NGO budget, and we're pretty sure they also fund some very obscure NGOs. There's one, Finland, for some reason, is a major hub for Jeff Halper's Israel Committee Against House Demolitions. There's apparently one person there, the equivalent of what we see in Belgium, and that happens, who promotes this organization and is able to get the funding largely because the people who make the funding decisions are unaware of the fact of what they're actually doing with the money. The fact that now Finland, for budgetary reasons, has to cut back a couple of million euros a year, euros, right? Finland's in the euro. That means that these NGOs will also get affected by that. And it's important for us to present them these alternatives. Spain went through the same process recently, and there are a number of other examples. The two main targets that we have, or the three main targets, are number one, the EU, that first slide I showed you of the very disproportionate focus against Israel. The European Parliament is now beginning to consider. They started in September. We will have a dedicated session or two on these budgets, and when the Parliament steps in, they may then vote against continuing these budgets. It won't be trivial, but that's one of the potential outcomes. There are other parliaments that are having reviews for the first time of this, and so that's a mechanism to expand it. So Brussels is one important point in this process. Germany should not be one of the leading supporters of organizations that call for the destruction of Israel, like Zochrot. They should not be. Yes, they are. Wait, no, let me finish. I'm going to finish my presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion. But between the German humanitarian aid organizations under church groups, Misorel, probably mispronounced, Brit für die Welt, other groups like that, government money going to very blatant anti-Israel activities, including funding for Zochrot. Some of the German political foundations, Rosa Luxemburg and Heinrich Bell, funding also groups like Zochrot and Breaking the Silence and other organizations which have almost no visibility and no impact. And they say they're doing it to help support the dialogue in Israel, public debate, because it's very important to democracy. But almost all those activities take place outside of Israel. And there are many other examples like that. So those are the countries that we're focusing on because there is a reasonable constituency there for arguing that this is not what they should be doing, both because it's a waste of money and also because it is counterproductive in terms of the goals, the moral goals that their countries set for themselves. The third example is the 4 countries in the Secretariat where the process of giving money, essentially blank checks, to a group at Birzeit University, a university which at one point and may still have a policy of not allowing Israelis to participate in any of their activities, that's very problematic. And again, the people who make those decisions in many cases don't know about them. Certainly the members of parliament in all these cases have never had hearings. That's not like the U.S. Congress, where if there's something problematic, you will immediately get a congressional response, and that will have an impact on policy. So our goal is to affect both the substance, particularly in the UN framework, and also in terms of the funding that goes for a lot of what becomes BDS and demonization. And I think with each year we see more and more ability to do that. I'll turn it over now to Dov. We'll talk about the wider picture. Okay, I skipped all the students for just a time.
Good morning, everybody. Money, 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 money. Lots of it coming from Europe. The question is kind of what's happening on our side. And so I'm sure that the real question that everyone is asking and the real reason for everybody coming today is you want to know what happened in Vegas. Well, as everyone knows the old saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But let me tell you what is happening in the philanthropic world and amongst pro-Israel organizations. Organizations such as NGO Monitor are one piece of a large puzzle that works to combat BDS. We handle, obviously, the NGO niche, and there are others dealing with the media, UN, campuses, courts, etc. There's a whole lot of organizations out there doing wonderful work, and they also deserve the support and the praise for everything that they're doing. But what we at NGO Monitor have long understood is that in order to be effective, we need to collaborate with the other organizations in the different spheres. Our research is requested by and shared with many different organizations. It's distributed all around the world to federations, APAC, JCRCs, Hillel houses, Jewish organizations worldwide, interfaith organizations, and Christian pro-Israel groups. Yet we're the only organization in the NGO space. We're happy to collaborate with everybody, let them use our research, and we see them as strategic multipliers. And what happened in Vegas is really a culmination of what we've been hearing from many of our donors over the past number of years. Too many organizations are working independently. Each one is developing their own strategies and trying different methods to combat BDS. On some campuses, the fight is left to individual students. On others, student groups, Hillels, Chabads, ICC, etc., do what they can with their limited resources and without any training. And on other campuses, academics do, or sometimes, unfortunately, more often don't, get involved. But the bottom line is that there is no coordination. There is a lack of resources for all the organisations. There's no education regarding the groups coming to speak on the various campuses, and a lack of training in how to respond to BDS activities. All of these groups, as well as NGO Monitor, are simultaneously knocking on the same donor doors looking for money to expand our resources. And now the donors have decided to join together to create a new fund, hopefully they won't call it the New Israel Fund, that will create an overall action plan. The plan will aim to divide the work that needs to be done between the most effective organisations in each field, and then improve coordination between the organisations. The new fund will provide resources to allow people like Gerald and myself to concentrate on putting NGOs out of business, rather than spend time and energy travelling the world in order to raise funds. Now, I want to say that this idea is not a new one. There have been many attempts in the past to create working groups such as the above, both at the Israeli government level, as well as major Jewish organisations, WJC, JNF, etc. However, this is really the first time that major donors have publicly announced a combined effort to combat BDS and to provide funding for it. In this new war paradigm, NGO Monitor places top priority and emphasis on intelligence gathering. That is, we do the research, particularly on exposing the funding for Campus BDS that involves NGOs and originates mainly in Europe. Having researched 15 Western European countries and the European Union that provide funding to these NGOs, we're now beginning to implement the next stage in our strategy and to put boots on the ground. NGO Monitor will soon begin a new project to hire additional staff that will travel to the EU, to European capitals and the United Nations in order to educate parliamentarians, government officials, civil servants and the local media, educating them where their taxpayer money is going and basically how it's being wasted. Our aim is to increase our impact, to get the funding reduced and cut off completely. The required funding for this initiative is $250,000, of which approximately 50% has so far been pledged. And I'm happy to stand up here and say if anyone here would like to help out or knows other people that would be willing to help out, please, Gerald and I are both available anytime to be spoken to about this. Moving forward, NGO Monitor hopes to play its part in these exciting new efforts that we believe will be a very real game changer. Thank you.